France, August 1944. Dust and smoke hung thick in the air. It smelled of iron, diesel, and burning rubber. The Sherman blue stag trembled in the mud, its treads groaning with each shallow inch. Inside, the air was close, oil, sweat, cordite. Private Jack Miller, 23, gripped the elevation dial with shaking hands. His breath fogged against the G*sight lens. Ahead, beyond a shattered farmhouse, a German Tiger emerged, massive, deliberate, its turret moving like a clockhand searching for its target. Through the intercom, the commander's voice cut through static. "Hold steady, Jack." Jack exhaled slowly. He adjusted the sight, 1 inch higher than regulation. A breath. A trigger pull. A flash. A roar. The world split open in fire and shockwave. When the smoke cleared, the Tiger was gone, a hole burning where it had stood. Jack's fingers trembled on the dial. He didn't know it yet, but that inch, that single forbidden inch, had just rewritten a rule older than the war itself. Northern France, 3rd U.S. Armored Division. I was the G*NR in blue stag, hull number chalked over by dust, an M4A1 with the 75mm M3 and a temperamental M70G sight that breathed fog when the weather dropped. Doctrine rode with us like a second commander. Do not duel a Tiger head-on. I could quote the field manual even now: maneuver, flank, withdraw. It was clean on paper: arrows, angles, prescribed ranges. Out here the arrows dissolved in hedgerow smoke, and the angles were whatever survived the next minute. Our battalion moved by fits, column on deer roads, dispersion in orchards, short bounds under a sky gray as boilerplate. Radios rasped with call signs and fragments: Sabre 2, hold short. King 6, button up. Red, red, red. Every field smelled like diesel and manure. Mud climbed the bogies and hardened into plates around the return rollers. Inside the turret, life reduced to inches: elevation handwheel, traverse handle, the tiny steel tongue of the trigger. A Tiger could hole us frontally at ranges where we were still searching for a weak seam. Everyone knew that. You learned it by rumor first, then by Rex. Shermans opened like tin, crew hatches fused by fire. We were given rules to stay alive. Rules, and armor theory. The Tiger's 8.8 cm KWK-36, the thickness at our glacis, the slope, the trunnion backlash, the danger of presenting a stationary silhouette. We rehearsed flanking drills on English commons while larks spiraled overhead and instructors talked about defilade like it was a prayer. But manuals are composed for a war that begins neat and never meets weather. When the smoke laid down, when you couldn't even see a hedge without optics, the page lost authority. By August the hedgerows were half shredded, and the roads were choked with every kind of wheel: ambulances, ammo trucks, bicycles, a French cart with a broken axle. We were told to conserve AP. M61 did not replenish as fast as he. We were told to wait for the tank destroyers if Tigers appeared. Doctrine said their long 70XS and the new M36S were the answer. Doctrine did not ride with us when the TDs were somewhere else and the only long barrel in sight wore a black cross. Inside Blue Stag it was always the same ritual. I wiped the sight lens with a wool glove until my breath stopped streaking it. I checked the backlash, 1 mil left, then right, feeling the turret settle. Loader called, AP up, and braced the next round against the cradle. The commander watched through periscope and slit, the driver listened for my voice as if it were the horizon itself. Beyond that, there was the world: barns folded by artillery, a dead horse that would not lie down, men running bent because an extra inch of height felt like treason. In those minutes before contact, the radio grew quiet. Silence meant distance closing. In silence, the orders in your head grew louder: flank, flank, withdraw. But behind us were fuel trucks, a maintenance half-track, a line of walking wounded who had refused litters because someone else needed them more. Withdraw to where? Maneuver with what lane? The earth itself had rules, and they were not the manuals. I had been measuring error since England. At 700 yards the reticle lied low. Heat built in the tube changed nothing, the drop stayed. I kept the numbers in a notebook that smelled of oil: range, bore wear, air like a damp sheet drawn between us and the target. I did not argue with sergeants, I wrote and watched and waited for the day when the page would matter more than the pamphlet. That day wore a German cross and moved with certainty. The Tiger announced itself by quiet, the way a heavy door does when greased. No clangor, only mass. Its turret traversed like a second hand. Head on, the book said. Do not. But there is a moment when orders become a kind of superstition, and all you have left is geometry and time. Out here, where mud swallowed boots and smoke erased rank, obedience could be fatal in the purest, cleanest way. I did not stop believing in training. I stopped believing it would arrive before the next round. Before the war, I was a machinist's apprentice in Rutland, Vermont, a town that smelled of pine sap and iron filings. The shop sat behind the grain mill, a long wooden room lined with belt-driven lathes that never quite stopped humming. I started at 17, sweeping shavings off the floor, then graduated to turning pistons and aligning crankshafts for the local tractor company. My father, Frank Miller, was foreman there. He believed in measurements the way some men believed in prayer. You don't tighten, he told me once, you align. My mother taught arithmetic at the county school. Between them, numbers ruled the house. Precision was virtue. Guessing was sin. Evenings were for sketches. I filled cheap notebooks with diagrams, ratchets, levers, imaginary gearboxes that might have powered nothing. I loved the order of it, the way pressure moved through steel like water through pipe, predictable, obedient. When machines failed, I studied them like doctors study lungs. Brakes had reasons. Friction had logic. It made sense in a world that rarely did. The depression never quite ended in our valley, we fixed everything twice before buying new. That habit of salvage shaped me. By 20, I could tell a cracked bearing by sound alone. The older men said I had listening hands. I thought I had a future in factories, maybe designing parts that would outlast their owners. Then came December 41. The radio in the shop corner spat out the news from Hawaii, and the world changed pitch. Within a week half the men at the benches were gone, drafted or enlisted. My father said I'd follow soon. I did, though not for glory. I wanted to understand the biggest machine ever built, war itself. Basic training reduced that curiosity to muscle memory. We learned the mechanics of K*ling, how to strip a Browning blindfolded, how to judge range by the blink of tracer light. They tested reflex, not reason. I kept my notebooks hidden, filling them at night under the cot light. Barrel harmonics, gear ratios on the Traverse motor, recoil lag in winter oil. The instructors called me Professor, with the usual mix of amusement and contempt. When they made me G*ner on an M4 Sherman, something in me settled. The tank was a machine I could read. Its noises spoke a language, the high whine of the transmission under strain, the soft click when the safety seated, the slow hydraulic sigh of turret traverse. Inside it, war became a matter of tolerances, too much pressure here, too little there. I wasn't brave, only precise. In England we trained across rolling farmland that looked nothing like France yet smelled the same, wet grass, cordite, manure. I learned to trust steel more than words. Orders changed with every instructor, steel stayed honest. The manuals described perfect conditions that never arrived. I remember sitting in a drizzle at Salisbury Plain, rain drumming the glacis, listening to a lieutenant read from Field Manual 17-12, Tank G*Nary, 1943 edition. Accuracy, he said, is the child of discipline. I believed him until I saw what discipline meant in practice, firing on command even when the barrel was off by a degree, advancing because the chart said advance though the ground said no. Machines obeyed physics, not ranks. At night I lay under the tank's hull for warmth, tracing the seam where armor plates met. The welds fascinated me, molten lines turned solid, proof that heat and pressure could bind what force would later try to tear apart. Maybe that was the point of the whole war, to see what held when everything else broke. Letters from home grew sparse. My father wrote once about a broken lathe spindle and ended with, "Remember, precision saves lives." I carried that line folded in my pocket through the Channel crossing. It was still there weeks later, sweat-stained, when we rolled through Normandy's wreckage, fields churned to gray mud, tanks burning like forges left open to the sky. By August 1944, I was 23. The notebook had swollen with grease and rain. I had recorded every deviation the M70G* sight gave me under field conditions, humidity, barrel heat, recoil creep. A pattern formed, a steady drop at distance that no instructor had mentioned. I didn't tell command, I told the machine, adjusting by instinct, 1 mil at a time. The others laughed, called it superstition. But metal listens better than men. It remembers angles. And in the end, when the tiger came through the smoke, it was that notebook, not the manual, that guided my hands. England, spring of 1944. The training ground at Tidworth was nothing but chalk dust and discipline. Rows of Shermans stretched across the hillside like a parked battalion of green coffins. The engines coughed, radiators hissed, and the smell of oil clung to everything, even sleep. I learned there that machines behaved differently when watched by authority. Under the eyes of instructors, the tanks ran perfect. Alone, they told the truth. Our M70 telescopic sight was the heart of my irritation. At short range, under 500 yards, it struck center every time. But when the target pushed farther out, the crosshair lied. The shell landed low, sometimes by a foot, sometimes more. Instructors blamed wind, dust, nerves. I blamed geometry. The sight housing was fixed to a bracket slightly offset from the G*N axis, heat warped it just enough to alter drop. I noted it the first week. By the second, I began testing quietly. When the others went to chow, I stayed back, pretending to clean optics. I marked range stakes in the field, 300, 5, 7. Then, alone, I fired with permission I did not have, recording every impact in a small spiral notebook. Temperature, wind, elevation, will position, result. Always low beyond 700 yards. Always the same curve. One afternoon Sergeant Roy Harper caught me kneeling by the hull, measuring with a carpenter's ruler I'd traded from a British mechanic. He laughed the way sergeants laugh when they smell deviation. "Relax, Miller. Fire enough rounds, and you'll hit something." I wanted to answer that hitting wasn't the point, understanding was. But the Army didn't train thinkers, it trained sequence. So I shut the notebook, nodded, and went back to regulation drills. Still, each live fire confirmed what the numbers whispered. The sight sagged with distance. A single inch on the elevation will corrected it. No one cared. Except me. At night the barracks windows rattled with rain. Men played cards or smoked ration tobacco rolled in pages torn from stars and stripes. I sat under the bunk light copying figures by hand. My crew thought it superstition. 1 inch up, I wrote. Effective compensation beyond 700 yards. It became a private litany, safer than prayer. The English spring turned to grey summer. We practiced G*Nary in mud that S*Kedet boots, shouting over radios that crackled like burning paper. Orders came down in thicker language: invasion, landing craft, beachheads. Everyone talked of France, of payback, of finally moving. I listened but thought only of trajectories. When you stare through glass long enough, the world outside turns to math. Our instructors drilled us on coordination, how to flank, how to withdraw under fire. Every exercise ended with the same phrase: never engage frontally. The tiger was the devil of those sermons. Its 88mm could pierce us through a barn wall, through another tank if we were unlucky enough to line up. We were told to fear it, to respect doctrine, to trust combined arms. But theory works in lines, war comes in corners. One night after G*Nary practice, Harper found me cleaning the breach. He squatted beside me, eyes tired but kind. "You're a careful one, Miller. Too careful. In battle, you'll freeze up if you keep counting mills." I shook my head. "Counting's what keeps me from freezing." He didn't answer, just clapped my shoulder and walked out into the rain. I remember watching him fade past the lamps, thinking how rules made sense only until the first misfire. We shipped out a week later. The Channel crossing smelled of diesel and vomit, the sea flat as poured steel. On the deck, I felt the notebook pressing against my chest under the field jacket, a small, defiant heartbeat. The numbers inside were useless on paper, forbidden in practice, but they were mine. When we landed in Normandy, everything I'd recorded began to matter. The first time I saw a tiger up close, it was burning at the edge of a hedgerow, hit from behind by a firefly. I studied the hole in its armor, the angle of entry, the melted ring around it. Geometry again. The difference between life and wreckage was always an inch. So I kept the note alive. Each engagement, each round fired, I measured and adjusted. My commander called me methodical, the loader called me lucky. I called it calibration. It wasn't rebellion yet, just attention. But war sharpens habits into choices, and before long, that single inch would demand proof. When I close my eyes now, I can still feel the handwheel under my palm, each thread of the screw rising like pulse. That was the beginning of disobedience, not in battle, but in measurement. I broke the rule of indifference. I asked why when the answer was supposed to be because. And from that question grew the inch that saved us all. Le Mans, August 1944. We were supposed to be advancing, not ambushed. The 3rd Armored had crossed the Sarthe under a sky thick with dust, engines coughing mud. Command said the enemy was retreating. But retreat, in France, often meant ambush wearing fatigue and silence. The column stretched for miles, Shermans, fuel trucks, field kitchens, a half-track carrying stretchers. Blue Stag rolled near the middle, engine running hot, radio tuned to static and hope. The first hit came just before dawn. A thunderclap from the right ridge, one flash, one scream of steel. The lead tank disintegrated, its turret spinning off into the ditch. A second round hit the road behind us, and for a moment the entire convoy froze, every man staring at the same impossible truth: the Tigers were waiting. 2 of them, maybe 3, hidden behind an embankment of freshly dug earth. Their 88mm shells carved through air like law itself. Inside Blue Stag, alarms wailed. The smell was electricity and fear, burned insulation, hot oil. The commander, Sergeant Roy Harper, slammed the intercom. "Pull back. That's an order." The driver hesitated. Outside, the fuel trucks were boxed in by trees. Behind them, medics worked over the wounded. Pulling back meant abandoning both. I looked through the periscope and saw shapes moving, enemy armor, silhouettes against the gray morning. The manual's voice rose in my head: do not engage frontally. Withdraw and flank. But the terrain offered no flank, just marsh and smoke. We were stuck on a single narrow road, hemmed in by ditches deep enough to drown a half-track. "Sergeant," I said, "if we move back, they'll cut the column apart." His reply came hard: "We're not built for this fight, Miller." I adjusted the elevation dial, 1 mil higher than standard. "Then we make one." The tank shuddered under impact. Dirt spattered the periscope. The loader swore, ramming another round into the breach. Harper's hand hovered near the transmitter switch, caught between doctrine and necessity. "Give me one sh*T, I said quietly. Just one. It wasn't bravery, it was geometry. The Tiger's turret ring, where armor thinned for rotation, was its only true weakness. At 700 yards my sight would fall low. An inch higher would bring the line true. I had written it 100 times. Harper stared at the burned wreck ahead, then at the rising glow from the embankment. He must have heard the same thing I did, the whine of the Tiger's traverse motor hunting us. His jaw tightened. "You've got one, Miller." I breathed through the mask, lined the crosshair not on the turret but just below it. My hand turned the wheel that single forbidden inch. "Target locked," I said. "Fire." The recoil slammed through my chest. For an instant the world went white. When vision returned, the Tiger had stopped. A plume of black smoke coiled from its base, slow and certain. Then it erupted, ammo cooking off, hatches flying. No one spoke. The loader whispered, "Holy Christ." A second Tiger moved to flank, but our first hit had ignited a fuel truck beside it. Flames rolled over the road, turning diesel into a wall of fire. Through the haze I could see German crews scrambling, shadows against orange. We fired again, not by rule but by rhythm. The next shell clipped the embankment and sent shrapnel into the trees. The Tigers withdrew. What remained of their ambush burned in place. Inside the tank, Harper's voice came low through the smoke. "Miller, do you realize what you've done?" I did. I had rewritten the manual with a single will turn. When silence finally settled, I checked the dial. The mark sat 1 inch above regulation, my heresy, my proof. Around us, the convoy began to move again. Men waved, though no one quite understood why we were still alive. Harper climbed out of the hatch, scanning the horizon. "We'll call that luck," he said. Luck was what officers called observation they hadn't made. I logged the sh*T in my notebook, same as always, range 710, elevation +1 inch, impact, turret ring, detonation confirmed. We spent the rest of that day clearing wrecks and pulling charred bodies from steel. The Tigers had been certain of the K*LL, their tracks still pointed downhill, perfect symmetry frozen in ash. I found one of their range tables later in the mud, columns of angles, neat, exact. I folded it into my pocket beside my own numbers. That night, under a tarp reeking of smoke, I could still feel the wheel beneath my hand, the resistance of its threads. 1 inch between obedience and survival. 1 inch between a rule and its reason. Outside, the road glowed faintly where oil burned in puddles. I watched it die out, thinking of all the manuals that never mention what to do when the book itself catches fire. Le Mans Sector, night of August 9, 1944. The smell of burnt diesel hung for miles. The air itself was heavy, like it had memorized the fire. Our column had survived the ambush, but survival left its own silence, a kind that drills into the bones. Harper sat on the glacis, helmet off, staring at the ridge where the Tigers had died. I stayed inside, tracing the threads of the elevation wheel with a rag, turning it back and forth by instinct. Each click felt like a heartbeat. "Broke the rulebook," Harper said finally, his voice somewhere between accusation and gratitude. "Yes, Sergeant." He didn't look at me. 1 inch, huh? 1 inch, I answered. It wasn't much to say, but it carried the weight of everything we'd just done, the smell of cordite, the recoil still ghosting through my arms. He nodded once, slow, as though testing the thought. "Don't make a habit of it," he said, and climbed down into the mud. That night, I wrote in the notebook. Range 710. Impact confirmed. Adjustment validated. Then below it, in pencil smudged by sweat, doctrine void at contact. The others came to me in the dark, one by one. The loader first. "You really hit that Tiger? Dead center?" I showed him the sight, the mark I'd scratched with my knife. A thin white notch, exactly 1 inch above the stamped line. He grinned like a child seeing magic. "You should patent that." The G*ner from the next Sherman leaned in to look. "You mind if I try that on mine?" I didn't answer. He took that as permission. By morning, 3 more tanks in our platoon had tiny new scratches beside their elevation dials, 1-inch increments, rough and secret. Nobody mentioned it to command. Nobody had to. Results spoke in survival rates. The official report called it, exceptional G*Nary under duress. I read it weeks later, typed clean on a clipboard, full of words like initiative and valor. But what it really meant was we'd done something we weren't supposed to, and it had worked too well to punish. The report made no mention of the inch. Still, men remembered. Mechanics started asking questions. One from Bravo Company came by with a wrench in his hand. "Heard you figured out a way to make the M70C straight," he said, trying to sound casual. "Show me that inch, will ya?" I showed him. He nodded, then took out a nail file and made the same notch on his sight housing. No ceremony. Just another quiet adjustment in a war of noise. By the end of the week, rumors spread faster than supply convoys. Tankers in the 3rd Armored started calling it the Miller Inch. Nobody knew the name, just the idea, that somewhere a G*ner had found a fix the engineers hadn't. Each retelling shifted details. Some said I'd bent the barrel on purpose, others that I'd used British optics. The truth was simpler, I'd listened to the machine when the manual refused to. Doctrine didn't change overnight, but men did. Crews began trusting instinct over procedure, sighting by feel instead of chart. Accuracy improved. So did survival. The manuals still warned, avoid direct engagement with Tiger-class armor. But in the field, rules bent quietly under the weight of lived evidence. A week later, a supply officer stopped me beside a fuel dump. "You the one with the inch thing?" he asked. I said nothing. He smiled anyway. "Keep it quiet, son." The brass don't like miracles they didn't authorize. He was right. A few days later, Command sent an inspector to check calibration records. We were told it was routine. The man had soft hands and clean boots, which meant he'd never fired inside a turret. He measured our optics, compared them to standard tolerances, found nothing amiss, and left satisfied. The scratch mark was small enough to pass as wear. After he left, Harper climbed back into the tank. "You know what they'd call this if it came from headquarters," he said. "Innovation." He wiped his hands on a rag, then looked at me with something close to pride. "But from us? They call it luck." That night the wind shifted. The fires on the ridge went out, leaving only the smell of ash. I lay beneath the tank, staring up at the belly plate, the steel still radiating the day's heat. Somewhere far down the road, other crews were marking their own notches, quiet acts of rebellion done in the name of mathematics. The war moved east, but the inch stayed, a secret stitched into steel. Sometimes I think about that tiger, the one I shouldn't have fought. Its wreck still sits there, half buried in the weeds of a French field. Farmers plow around it now. Maybe they see the hole under the turret ring and wonder about the man who made it. If they ever ask, tell them it wasn't courage that did it. It was calculation, and a refusal to let a book decide when we die. Falaise Pocket, August 20, 1944. The war moved fast that week, too fast for the dead to keep up. The German retreat had become a stampede, and every road from Argenton to Chambois was lined with burning vehicles, black smoke curling like handwriting across the horizon. We were ordered east, pushing through wreckage and surrendering pockets. For the first time, the tigers weren't hunting us. They were running. But victory has its own silence. Between bursts of engine noise, I could hear the creak of the Sherman's hull, the distant moan of wind through telephone wires, and under it all, the hum of calculation. 1 inch. I could still feel it through my gloves, that defiant notch in the elevation wheel. I'd meant it for survival. It had become something else, an inheritance. The men started using it without ceremony. Every morning before rollout, G*ners would lean into their sights, tap the mark with a thumbnail, a ritual of quiet superstition. They didn't call it rebellion. They called it the inch. "Set your inch," someone would ask, half joking. "Always," came the answer. In Le Neubourg, I saw it etched onto the casing of another tank's dial, +1M, crude, scratched with a bayonet tip, but there. My heresy had gone feral. We bivouacked beside a hedgerow littered with broken glass and discarded field manuals. I picked one up out of habit, FM 17-12, Tank G*Nary. The pages were damp, ink bled from rain. I flipped to the familiar line, "In case of enemy heavy armor, withdraw and call for air or tank destroyer support." I almost laughed. In theory, that was sound. In practice, radio static didn't obey logic, and no pilot ever saw what we saw from a tank cupola. Doctrine belonged to distance. War belonged to proximity. That night, Harper found me sitting on the hull with the manual open across my knees. "You planning to rewrite it?" he asked. "I already did," I said. 1 inch at a time. He grinned in the dark. "They'll never print that. They don't have to. The crews already know." He stared into the field for a long time before saying, "You think we'll keep fighting this way? Listening to machines instead of orders? Maybe that's the only way to win," I said. "Let the tank teach us." Days blurred. Villages passed, Orbeck, Lisieux, 100 names I'd never remember. Each fight felt smaller now, more mechanical, like the war itself had shifted from human to engineered momentum. Our platoon's K*LL count rose, casualties dropped. The difference was measurable, cold math carved into survival rates. No one mentioned me in reports. That was the point. The inch wasn't a person anymore. It was a correction absorbed into instinct. In Evreux, a new replacement joined us, Private Green, 19, still shiny with regulation polish. During inspection, he asked why every sight in the company had a scratch mark above the scale. Harper just told him, "Ask Miller." Green found me cleaning the breach. "Sir, did you really invent that thing?" "Not invent," I said. "Observed." He frowned, waiting for the lesson. I pointed to the tank's flank, where soot still clung in stripes. That's what happens when you follow every order exactly. He didn't ask again. By September, the brass caught wind. Someone at battalion level requested calibration data. They wanted to know why the division's hit probability had spiked 30% without new optics. Inspectors came, clipboard and immaculate. They measured, nodded, and left, none the wiser. The inch hid in plain sight, too small for bureaucracy, too large for coincidence. Rumor said the design bureau back home was reviewing reports from the front. Engineers theorized about sight misalignment, optical drift, barrel wear, every technical explanation except the truth, that a few thousand G***ners had stopped treating the manual as scripture. They had adjusted, quietly, collectively, as if the machines themselves had whispered back. One morning near the Seine, I caught a glimpse of a Sherman from another regiment, its turret chalked with the words Miller's Margin. The crew waved as they passed. I didn't wave back. I wasn't sure I wanted a name attached to disobedience, even if it worked. Names attract questions. Questions attract orders. We crossed into Belgium by early September. The fields were open now, less hedgerow, more horizon. The war felt lighter but never safer. On the third day, we halted beside a wrecked Tiger half buried in mud. Its G***N pointed skyward, frozen mid-gesture. I climbed onto its hull, pressed my palm to the cold steel. The hole I'd made weeks earlier had already rusted around the edges, 1 inch below the turret ring, neat, final. I could almost hear the echo of that sh**T, the sound that had rewritten a rule. Harper climbed up beside me. You ever think about what comes after this? I nodded. Machines'll keep improving. Men will keep finding the inch they're not supposed to. He smiled. Then maybe that's how wars end, when the rules run out of inches. The wind smelled of cordite and rain. Far off, engines started again, a chorus of steel learning its own language. I closed the notebook for the last time, the pages swollen with sweat and oil. Inside, one line stood alone, +1 inch. Effective range, survival. Bastogne, winter 1945. Snow muted everything, the engines, the screams, even the laws of sound. What had beg***n as mud and thunder in France had turned into frost and silence in Belgium. The Ardennes lay buried under white sheets, and the tanks looked like ghosts of themselves, grey shapes under camo nets, breath steaming through exhaust pipes like sighs. The Blue Stag had survived 5 months of advance, 6 mechanics, 2 loaders, and 1 manual that no longer mattered. I kept the notebook in my jacket, the paper stiff with cold and oil. We weren't chasing anymore. The Germans had counterattacked, December 16th, they called it a bulge, as if it were a passing shape on a map. To us it was an erasure, roads swallowed by ice, supplies vanished, orders lost. The same men who once followed our inch now followed instinct alone. Radios failed, visibility dropped to arm's length. Combat became a sound heard but never seen. Our engine froze twice that week. We heated the oil with rags soaked in gasoline, praying the fumes wouldn't light. Harper was gone, promoted, then reassigned to another battalion near St. Vith. The new commander, Lieutenant Morgan, was by the book, every inch of him regulation. He called the scratch on my sight tampering and ordered it filed smooth. I told him I'd do it. I didn't. The mark was too deep now, both in steel and in me. One night he caught me adjusting the dial before dawn patrol. You still believe in that nonsense? He asked. It's not belief, sir, I said. It's correction. He glared at me through the cold. The army doesn't need corrections from privates. I almost laughed. Then it shouldn't build mistakes. We didn't speak again that morning. The offensive hit us at 0600. Artillery first, trees snapping like bones. Then armor. The horizon flickered orange between snow flurries. Through the periscope I caught glimpses, Panzer IVs advancing in column, the same geometry I'd seen near Le Mans. Doctrine said hold position until contact. I'd learned better. We fired first. The first sh**T landed short. The second found its mark. The old inch still held true. The Tiger that led them burned black against the snow, a shadow of summer repeating itself in winter. Morgan shouted for me to cease fire, to wait for artillery coordination, but the shell casing was already clattering to the floor. I wasn't fighting Germans anymore. I was fighting delay. Hours passed in fragments: reload, fire, recoil, silence. When our ammunition ran dry, the lieutenant had stopped giving orders. He just stared at the glowing wreckage ahead of us, steam rising from his coat. "You disobeyed," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "You saved the flank." "I know." He nodded once, like a man conceding to gravity. That night, while we dug the tank out of snowdrift, Morgan stood beside me, watching frost form over the barrel. "They'll court-martial you someday," he said. "Probably," I answered. "But not tonight." He smiled then, the first time I'd seen it. "Keep your inch, Miller. Maybe it's the only thing still working out here." Word traveled, as it always did. By January, the scratch had returned to every site in the company, even under fresh paint. Mechanics called it winter calibration. Officers called it nothing at all. The army had a habit of absorbing rebellion once it proved efficient. The inch had stopped being mine long ago, now it was simply part of the machine, unofficial doctrine written into the hands of those who turned the dial. When spring came, we rolled east again. The snow melted, revealing the frozen dead, men, horses, and machines indistinguishable after months beneath ice. I watched the fields blur past through the cupola and wondered what would happen to all this precision after the shooting stopped. At the Elba, we were ordered to halt. The war was ending not with a roar but with paperwork. Morgan handed me my discharge notice in April. He shook my hand. "You were right," he said quietly. "About the site." I shrugged. "It wasn't the site, sir. It was the inch." That night I opened the notebook one last time. The pages smelled of oil and years. I tore out the final sheet and folded it into my pocket, +1 inch. Effective range, survival. The rest I burned in the barrel beside the tank, watching the numbers curl into ash. When the fire died, the steel still glowed faintly beneath the stars, just enough light to read the faint mark beside the dial. It caught the glow like a scar. I touched it once, gently, as if saying goodbye to an old wound. The next morning, we left Blue Stag where it stood, snow melting off its armor like the last breath of something that had outlived its purpose. The war would move on. The inch would remain. Vermont, autumn 1946. The war ended quietly for me, in a railway car that smelled of coal and wet wool. The uniform itched. The medals were small and forgettable. Nobody mentioned the inch, or the tank, or the rule that wasn't a rule anymore. The army liked endings neat, mine wasn't. When I stepped off the train in Rutland, the air carried sawdust instead of cordite, maple instead of diesel. My father's shop still stood by the grain mill, paint blistered, belt drives silent under a film of dust. The world had gone back to pretending it made sense. For a week, I couldn't stop listening for engines. Every noise, tractors in the fields, trucks on the highway, sounded like an M4 starting cold. I'd wake before dawn and wait for orders that didn't come. Sleep was a place filled with the sound of treads and the hollow thud of shells. Then I'd remember that the war was over, that no one needed a G***ner who measured the world by inches anymore. I went back to work at the lathe. The machines were smaller, the stakes lower. Precision still mattered, 1 degree off and a piston would seize, but there was no fire attached to failure, no scream if you missed by a fraction. I caught myself adjusting the feed screw by instinct, a perfect inch each time, and hated that my hands remembered before my mind did. The first winter home, my father asked if I'd learned anything useful over there. I told him I'd learned that manuals are written by survivors. He didn't answer. We stood together at the bench, the air thick with oil vapor, and I realized the world he trusted, rules, methods, guarantees, had died somewhere between Normandy and Bastogne. At night I repaired watches for neighbors. It felt right, working with things small enough to understand. The click of gears replaced the echo of G***fire. Every watch I touched came back to life with the same rhythm: tension, release, correction. Somewhere in that sound, I found peace, or the closest thing to it. Word of the inch had spread far beyond me. I learned it months later through an old comrade's letter from Kansas. "They're teaching it at G*Nary School," he wrote. "Don't call it the Miller inch, they've given it a number, something technical. But we know." Attached was a photograph, a line of Sherman's information, dials etched at exactly the place my knife had first cut. I didn't frame the picture. I put it in a drawer. The world didn't need to remember me, it just needed to keep learning. The men who had followed the mark didn't talk about rebellion, they talked about adjustment, a quiet respect for the living. That was enough. Sometimes kids from the new generation stopped by the shop, asking about the war. They wanted stories of heroism, of thunder and fire. I told them about calibration. About patience. About a single will turned when the book said no. They'd nod politely, disappointed, and I'd return to my work. You can't make glory out of correction. One evening, an old mechanic from the plant brought me a broken pressure gauge. He said it came from a surplus Sherman scrapped at the depot in Burlington. I opened the casing and found the inner dial marked with a faint white notch, 1 inch above standard. My chest went cold. I traced it with a fingertip, the paint chipped but intact. That tank had never met me, never heard my name, yet it carried the same mark. I set the gauge on the shelf beside my tools. A relic of logic surviving chaos. Years passed. Factories changed to peacetime products, tractors, trucks, then refrigerators. Precision was still worshipped, but danger was gone. Sometimes, though, when a machine vibrated wrong or a bearing hummed off key, I'd feel that old instinct rise, the pull to correct what wasn't in the manual. I'd measure, adjust, and think of all the men who never came home to do the same. The war had given me one truth: survival is engineering, not luck. You measure, you adapt, you cheat the margin by the smallest degree necessary. Every rule that matters is written afterward, by those who refuse to die by the old ones. Now the shop is quiet again. The belt motors hum like memory. On my bench sits the last notebook I ever kept, its pages filled not with ranges but with repair notes. The final entry is nothing but a line, drawn straight across the paper, exactly 1 inch above center. Beneath it, a single phrase written in the same cramped hand that once recorded K*LL distances. Plus 1 inch. Effective range, survival. I closed the cover and listened to the silence settle, the same way it did after every sh*T, every correction, every fire that ended with understanding. Somewhere outside, a truck backfires, and for an instant the world aligns again, metal, motion, measure. 1 inch above perfect. 1 inch above rule. Rutland, years later. The town forgot the war, as towns are meant to. The boys who'd left came back older, quieter, some limping, all changed. I worked until my hands stiffened, then taught the apprentices what my father once told me: mechanics isn't about muscle, it's about precision. They nodded, not knowing how far that truth had traveled. Sometimes at night, I'd tune the radio and hear the hum between stations, the same static that once carried orders through the tank. It sounded like breath inside armor. I'd close my eyes and see the sight wheel, the inch of difference between disaster and design. They say history remembers victories. But the men who lived remember corrections, small, invisible, necessary. I wasn't a hero. I was a measurement. 1 inch too stubborn to die. And somewhere, in every tank that still stands rusting in the weeds, that mark remains, plus 1 inch. Effective range, survival.